welcome back to Frankly Speaking. I'm your host, Frank. Let's call this chapter 13 of Mussolini, an Italian American perspective. Okay, guys, tonight I want to do something different. I've studied this fascism thing now for almost 3 years, and I studied it from a political perspective. And, with me, with fascism, it's an interesting thing because I started on this journey basically to understand more what fascism was, because I felt that the political dialogue in America post the 2020 election and the political right throwing the word fascism around to describe the current environment in America was kind of off. And that's where my curiosity peaked in some ways. And so while I've studied the practical political events and applications and theories of politics, the one area that's been more difficult, again, because I don't have a whole lot of access to Italian information, is more of the social structure and the cultural structure of Italian life under socialism. And I turned to a couple of critics of fascism to get that side of the story from them, to hear it from them, to keep me honest and keep me balanced with everything, because I like to look at both sides of this issue. The first critic that I found was this author named Bosworth, right? BJD Bosworth, I believe is what it is. He's an Australian historian, and he's written lots of books on Mussolini. I've seen his books in places like Barnes and Noble. Believe it or not, I still got a Barnes and Noble in my area. And he's kind of an interesting character because for him, the study of fascism seems to be more one of a political motivation. He says, at least in his Wikipedia page, it says that, as I was looking him up, and I know Wikipedia is not the best source, but Wikipedia claims that for Bosworth, his hard criticism of Mussolini and fascism is basically because we cannot dare, as historians, allow for the evil nature of fascism to ever rise again. And so he's been critiqued for politicizing his historical analysis of Italian fascism. So with me, that's kind of a put off. The last thing I want to do is get interpretations of anything from far left ideologues, right? I mean, there's enough propaganda from the communist side of the war after the defeat of fascism, the collapse of fascism after World War II. There's enough of that. And so what we've had is this debate between sort of the old thinking of the evil nature of fascism, its suppressive, anti-freedom, anti-liberty, anti-enlightenment tenets that offend our Western sensibilities. And then another side that has emerged that has looked deeper into the documents and then more scholastic work on fascism, and they're seeing a more moderate picture in regards to how fascism conducted itself, the role Mussolini played in World War II. And so the anti-fascist historical side labels this new side that's doing a rehabilitation of Mussolini fascism, a revisionist perspective that is meant to be a pejorative term, right? We're rewriting history. Monday morning quarterback, right? The standard was set after the war with this tyrannical view. The West won, freedom, liberty, they prevailed over the evils of course, not just Nazism, but fascism in Italy. And this is kind of the debate that we have. And so whenever you read a more moderate and balanced side of Mussolini Italian fascism, you will be called a revisionist. So with that in mind, as I searched deeper today, I found another historian by the name of Emilio Gentile, an Italian historian. I did a bunch of searches today, okay? And what's difficult about this, again, is that I don't have or don't speak or understand the fluent Italian. I watched a bunch of Emilio Gentile today on YouTube talking about fascism, things of that nature. I understood some of it, but it's just difficult for me. I'm fluent Sicilian, but the Italian is tough. And so I'm left to, again, as I said in the last cast, to English interpretations. And so I did find, however, a YouTube video, and I will link this one up, that essentially gives us a synopsis of Emilio Gentile's book entitled Fascism as a Political Religion. And Emilio Gentile is interesting. He writes books on cultural phenomenons, right? Particularly politics as a religion, right? And he sees fascism as a sort of secular religion between the 1920s and 30s. He actually eventually wrote a book on American politics back in 2008 about George W. Bush. I forgot the name of the book, but oh yeah, God's Democracy. God's Democracy. Effectively talking about how George W. Bush used evangelicalism and the scope of religion to capture the two elections in 04 and 08. And in his opinion, from the synopsis that I read, adversely push out other ideologies in the American mainstream, particularly other religions. And it's how he sees things from a cultural perspective. And with fascism, in this particular video that highlights this book by Emilio Gentile, he views fascism in the same sense, that fascism was a sort of religion. It took lots of its tenets from the Catholic Church and it applied them in a secular sense. And this is where we get really the idea and the critique of fascism, which is the worship of the state, as so many pundits have said. But it really leads us to the history of Italy and how we got to that point, how fascism kind of comes to power. Remember, the Kingdom of Italy is a bunch of different sectarian, I guess, provinces governed by old royal families that left many of the peasant class, well, starving, to use the word, or really struggling in a worldly sense. This led to the rise of sort of leftist movements by individuals like Manzini and eventually Garibaldi. For Manzini, that led the first revolution in Italy in the mid-1800s, he was inspired by the American and the French revolutions, where they were going to cast off the old aristocratic landowners and replace them with a democracy and the will of the people. And as Manzini himself said, let's get rid of these old aristocratic classes and put God and the people in power. So I think Manzini's first attempt to revolutionize Italy failed, but then came Garibaldi. And Garibaldi, taking district by district or province by province, starting in Sicily, moving all the way up the Italian peninsula surrounding the Vatican, eventually won. The papal lands were lost by the church. The Pope Pius IX at the time, writing about the importance of subsidiarity when unheard of, and the Pope effectively locked himself, or the papacy, for 70 years until, ironically enough, the Lateran Accords that Mussolini signed with the church, something I talked about here in the series earlier. But even with this new element of democracy, because Manzini wanted a pure democracy of some kind, right? Modeled after the Americans and the French. But Garibaldi sets up a monarchy with democratic elements as a sort of a way for the people to be involved in the political system, a softer attempt. And of course, for the longest times, there was many problems, much problems with the Italian democratic, sort of system that they had. It was notoriously corrupt. In fact, the fascists took advantage of that when they came into power. And part of the issue was there was not a unifying factor that ever brought Italians together. Remember, these were distinct regions, different cultures, different languages, or at least dialects, right? And all of a sudden now you're thrown in together into a new country that's called Italy. What brings these people together? Obviously, they had the Catholic faith. And that's what Mussolini would use, ironically enough. It would be the Lateran Accords that kind of cemented the idea of Italy. He needed the church eventually. But the struggle was on for Italian identity. So we see these factions of all these divided parties, everybody having different interests from different regions, and the king having to deal with a parliamentary system that was getting nothing done, and a monarchy that in many respects, some will say was a little weak. And this is essentially what happens after World War I. The veterans of Italy that fought against the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, they come home, they won the war, but they're watching their nation being taken over by Bolsheviks. And now comes the rise of fascism. And the question is, right, as many of these ex-communists, now fascists, starting sometime in 1919 and 1920, what kind of radical communist elements would they bring to this fascist ideology? That's why some critics of fascism have said that, well, fascism is basically Marxism without the internationalism, right? I'm not sure I agree with that, but definitely fascism was a heavy nationalist movement. And the fact was, when they got back from the war, the Bolsheviks were kind of taking over the country, right? Weak monarch, couldn't control its districts. And however the complexities of this merger between the kingdom and the monarch and the fascists happened, they effectively needed each other. And so when the violence between the Bolsheviks and the fascists start to break out, 1919, 1920, the fascists have the backing of the central government at that point. Because what the fear of the king was at the time was what happened just 2, 3, 4 years earlier in Russia, the Bolshevik Revolution. It was about to happen in Italy. And with a weak centralized authority, a military that you don't want to send out into the streets of Italy fighting potentially some Italian citizens, it would have been bad optics. It would have rose up, and as the Tsar of Russia was overturned, this was the greatest fear of the king of Italy. Hence, the fascists come up as sort of a militia, a private army, sanctioned by the monarchy, and things get bloody in the streets of Italy. And this is one of the things that the detractors of fascism always mention, is that the fascists went too far in their violence. And I think we would have to look at some of those cases on an individual basis, without a doubt. And I think there's some fair critiques there. My issue with that is, I need an explanation from the anti-fascist side. How were you supposed to deal with Bolsheviks taking over your country, right? Because the Bolsheviks were taking over markets, they were taking over businesses, right? They were appealing to the mass poor of Italy. Again, the lack of industrialization, a heavy agricultural society, land monopolized by the aristocratic class. And this is how communists always come to power in various nations. They go to the poor with promises of collectivization, and this works. And in many ways, it was starting to work in Italy. In fact, from one of the books I read, where communism really had its biggest influence was actually in Sicily, because there they really had some economic hardships there. Again, Italy just doesn't come full blown into or post industrial revolution. It lacks natural resources to create that industry of good paying jobs like we had in America. America is a nation full of natural resources. The problem America was having, of course, the Protestants were already contracepting, and it was a massive nation, and that's why they had to bring in a Catholic underclass from Europe in order to make the underclass work. The Irish, the Italians, the Germans, the Polish, right? But in Italy, especially Sicily, you didn't have this. What eventually brought Sicily into the fold was Mussolini and the Concordat, the Lateran Accords, because while Sicily was struggling economically, communism was starting to take its role or its effect there. It was still deeply Catholic, right? And so you have a situation there where this country is divided. The fascists come in, they boot up. Fascists had an actual popular support among many of the what you would call the middle class in Italy at the time, because they would actually protect land, right? They would actually protect businesses. Now, of course, as we go into the violence between the Bolsheviks, the communists, and the fascists, things happen, right? One of them that I know of very specifically was the massacre in Turin, or the massacre of Turin. There, it was a situation where communists killed two fascists, and as a reprisal, the fascists went down there, and I believe they went down there with the Royal Army, right? This is how you know they had legal authority to do some of this stuff, at least. They responded, and they killed 10 communists, burnt down the, I don't know, newspaper factory or something of that nature. But keep in mind, right, and this is the hard part, and how do you deal with this if you're the monarch? Think of Spain about 15 years later, after King Alfonso XIII steps down and lets the election process go through and the communists win, and the reaction and the after effects of that election, as the communists basically collectivize everything. They abolish the church, they bastardize the institution of marriage, they hunt down all the monarchists and the fascists, and it caused all kinds of chaos in a society that's deeply Catholic, but now it's Bolshevik Russian sort of ideas that are running through this Catholic nation. This is why even in France, the church sided with Franco. Franco, again, considered by anti-fascists as this bad guy, but as Catholics, right, we had seen in the Bolshevik Revolution, the Bolsheviks just burned down, destroy some 24,000 churches, tens of thousands of priests, nuns, Catholics, Orthodox murdered for their faith, right? There's a history here that we recognize, and this is happening in Italy. The Vatican is there, the papacy is there, right? And so when push comes to shove and we're making political alliances, while the fascists initially were a secular ideology, they were willing to work with the church. Don't get me wrong, the fascists initially had their own ambitions, their own ideas in many ways, but they did not outright attack the faith in Catholicism itself. They might have had some practical uses for it in their minds. But as we see later on, Mussolini, who kind of evolves into his Catholic faith, it's a very interesting dynamic, because at the Lateran Accords, he gives the church a lot of power. It's interesting in and of itself. You never would have seen that from the Marxists. But anyways, you got this social revolution going on. And this is how the king decides to sort of relate to it or act with it, siding with the fascists, and the fascists win out at the end of the day. And eventually Mussolini, has the march on Rome. Most of these anti-fascists will tell you, well, he captured the government using intimidation tactics, even though we have the reports that the king could have stopped Mussolini. Remember, nobody died. It was not a violent revolution. Nobody died to Mussolini's ascent into power. The top generals of the Italian Royal Army were with the fascists. They supported the fascists, and he's elevated to prime minister, right? Eventually, Mussolini begins to abolish democracy, doesn't like democracy, and by 1926, he's pretty much in control of the country as a dictator. All right, that's in a nutshell. All right, now, so what Emilio Gentili argues, of course, as a cultural historian, is, of course, some of the problems of fascism and what it demanded of its citizens. The first of which he would argue, or it seems to argue in this video, is that individual rights pretty much are suppressed. And now we almost have see, I don't want to say collectivist, because I know Italy wasn't collectivist, right? It didn't persecute the proletariat. It wasn't collectivist. But it adhered to sort of a social allegiance, right? A sort of secular religion is what Mr. Gentili argues here. And the social religion would play out in every fabric of Italian society and culture, and strict adherence and allegiance was demanded by the fascist regime. Okay? Let's see here. I got a few notes here. The idea was everything for the state, effectively, right? This is the idea of, again, the worship of the state: believe, obey, and fight. That was one of the models. And that as individuals, we work for the state, that we are here to support the state and the leaders of the state, that the leaders take on a sort of divine sort of status, and that the leaders are to be worshiped according to Mr. Gentile. And that when you make that great sacrifice for your country, you will be honored in this world. Your memory will live on for making the ultimate sacrifice, a sort of a martyr or secular saint, of course, but you as an individual are to step aside. The moment that your country or your leaders ask you to do something, you're not supposed to question it. You're supposed to go follow orders, and serve your nation, serve your leaders effectively. Which already sets up a fundamental question, right? We have religious imagery all over the country. Fascism and Mussolini love to use different images, right? You have the fasci symbol, of course, the sticks, the bundle of sticks. One stick can be broken, but if you have a bundle of sticks, you can't break it. So everybody coming together for the sake of the nation. They use artwork, intimidating artwork, as many fascist or authoritarian regimes use to intimidate and to indoctrinate, of course, the population, not to oppose the current regime. Educational systems were taken over. Kids were indoctrinated into this fascist system. Later on, we will see this battle between the church and Catholic and ultimately fascism. Who gets the church first? That's another interesting story in and of itself. And so, and ordinary citizens were basically cogs in a system that effectively had little or no rights. The state came first. Individuality or individual rights was diminished. And of course, this is seen as sort of a heresy in our modern liberal world today, that post-Enlightenment emphasizes individual rights over the collective, right? This is the battle that capitalists and communists or classical liberals and Marxists fight on a daily basis, right? The communists believe in total collectivization, and the classical liberals believe everything should be privatized, right? And citizens of that nation should have a blind faith, right? You put aside your personal ambitions and you do everything for the state, no questions asked, and you serve at the whim of your leaders. And fascist leaders themselves are supposed to be sacrificial for the love of their nation, right? You didn't rise up in the elements of government and acquire power for your own sort of personal gratification. You rose up to power to serve the nation. And at the end of the day, everybody should be prepared to die for the nation, right? So when the leadership, in this case, Mussolini, El Duce, which means the leader, says we're going to war in Ethiopia, or we're going to fight the communists in Russia, or we're going to fight the liberal republics, in the West, everybody gets up, everybody serves the Duce, everybody's a cog in the system. Individual rights are suppressed. And this is the narrative that apparently Emilio Gentili sets up. Now, I am reading an interpretation of the book because the book is in Italian and the book is very expensive. But the general thesis is that, again, individual rights are suppressed and a collective value in favor of the nation is what is encouraged. And as I listen to this today, I will tell you it's a hard one. And if the social structure of Italy at the time, under the fascist regime, was exactly as explained in Mr. Gentili's book, I will say that's a difficult one to accept. Because I do believe while individualism and individual rights sometimes can go too far and too extreme, and we're seeing that in today's modern liberal world, there is a place for individualism. I think it's part of our human nature, self-preservation really being our first natural instinct. And to completely suppress that for the state, I think it is an oppressive measure. Again, because I haven't looked into the social metrics and structures of fascism as close. Well, let me take that back. It's not that I haven't looked at. I've read a ton of books, okay, on this. I've never gotten this perspective before, not the sort of the societal or the cultural decree. When I read guys like Nicholas Farrell, Mussolini and New Life, when I read Richard Lamb, right? I see the political apparatus of the fascist system, and in many ways, it makes sense. Now, obviously, in those books, you do have a certain aspect of this, what do you want to call it here? For the greater good, right? Or should I say, for the common good idea? Because, see, that's the interesting thing. When you compare this fight to the death between classical liberals and communism, what is it effectively? The communists will say no individual rights at all. It's all collectivization. It's all about the state. The state owns everything. Classical liberals, at least in theory early on, argued that no, everything is about privatization, right? Everything is up to individual rights. And the collective good, of course, only brings us closer to communism. And as I've always argued, I have a problem with both extremes because I do believe the common good exists. At the same time, we don't want to give the state too much power. So these two factions are arguing two extremes. In the case of the communists, they own the means of production, they own the land, they own the state, they own everything. And individuals are working really without any incentive. And again, that basic natural instinct of self-preservation is suppressed, right? And with the classical liberal West, it's kind of like everything is individual rights. And so the moment you start to get, I don't know, ideas of, for example, religious liberty, right? where we get to a point that religion is a tool for every individual to play with according to his desires or wants or passions, well, then we have to justify all of that and throw out sort of the tenets of history of faith and the analogy of the faith itself going back for 2,000 years. This is why we now have a country where Satanists and Christians are in the same military, or satanic temples and Christian churches and Catholic churches are effectively in the same neighborhood, competing for hearts and minds in a battle arena of ideas. Pornography is a great example to me. Is that freedom, or is that a moral issue that society needs to deal with and outright get rid of, because it, for the common good, right? It's shown and proven to have ill effects on society. See, and both sides take an extreme, because then you have the Glenn Becks of the world tell you common good has got to be completely thrown out, because the political apparatus can't be controlled. And once you go down the path of the common good, we're going to wind up with communists, right? And of course, my response to that is, then what good is your political system if natural law can be effectively erased from your society? And look at the state of the West today. We can't get this under control now under the guise of individual rights, never mind the economic factors of the rise of the oligarchical rule of the nation and how the oligarchs have taken over the political system now, all done under the guise of what? Individual rights. You got a problem, Glenn. You got a problem. And so these are two extremes at the end of the day. How do you bring these together? Now, from my understanding, fascism, at least reading other books, was an attempt to find a middle ground in between the two. And so when Emilio Gentili argues that there was an extreme form of the worship of the state and that individual rights were suppressed in Italy, I haven't read that analysis to that degree. Now, I have read some elements of that, right? There are moments where the fascists would say, listen, we're trying to build a better culture that simply goes around the material dialectic, right? Because what effectively are classical liberals and communists always arguing over? One says the state should monopolize everything. The other one says the individual should monopolize everything. For the fascists, it was more of a comprehensive ideology where the economy was part of it, but they wanted to bring history, tradition, religion, faith, right? And this was all part of a more comprehensive political ideology to balance these extreme sort of natural impulses to focus simply on the material world. That's how I've understood it. And so this is the bottom line. If Mr. Gentili is correct in his analysis in his book, and again, I will get it if I find an English version of it, then I have a problem with the fascist system. Because I do believe, to a certain degree, individual rights matter. And to suppress individual rights in totality, as this video that I will link below, that makes things problematic. And you're not going to get a society, I believe, that moves forward if there's not the sort of worldly incentive to succeed. That being said, what I have read about the social structure of fascism in other books is that they understood some of the challenges that classical liberals from the Anglo countries brought into place, right? For example, and as one example, in Italy under Mussolini, you had a bachelor's tax. Now, a bachelor's tax. Why a bachelor's tax? Well, fascists wanted to encourage the growth of the nation. Fascists believe that a man should not be pursuing sort of his individual ambitions and worldly awards and worldly accolades, right? First and foremost, that the family is a central unit of society, and that a man can only pursue those worldly accolades after he has a family. So the bachelor's tax was there, one, to encourage the growth of the family. Italy needed to grow to compete with the Britain, the British Empire, America, France. And then on the other hand, of course, you have bachelors that were taxed. And so now you have a political system. And I think in some ways, Mr. Gentili is right in the sense that it's a form of a secular religion that encouraged men to first have families and then seek personal accomplishment after that. And so the question, of course, is, right, are you suppressing the individual rights of the individual? Because you're forcing him or to have a family at the day before he can pursue earthly, worldly accolades. Now, on one hand, you say, well, yeah, that is the suppression of individual rights. Okay, I get that, right? And where's the balance of that? Because we've seen in the West this idea, success for the sake of success, accolades for the sake of accolades. And we now have a world, at least in the Western liberal republics, where we're not having children anymore. And men have completely opted out for worldly accolades. And we have dying populations, families that are never formed or families that are being destroyed. The idea of the family has been completely diminished because of this pursuit of the worldly accolades and power and material and money and wealth and all this stuff. It's not exactly a healthy society. See, the problem the classical liberals have is this, right? This is the problem that they have. They have championed the idea of American prosperity since the end of World War II, that America is the most prosperous nation in the history of the world. The economic advancements, the lifestyles, right, that we all have, and the American dream with the house and a white picket fence, climbing the corporate ladder, our technology, our medicine that's advanced, right? We've lived lives that only the peasants of the past could have dreamed of. And that's because we unleashed these individual rights and unleashed the economic engine of prosperity through individual rights. That's their claim to fame, right? And who could argue with that, right? Who could argue with that? And I think it's a strong argument. However, here's what I haven't heard the classical liberals address. In your pursuit of all your economic prosperity in the name of individual rights, at the same time, the culture and the family have deteriorated at a pace not since biblical times. We've had the complete moral breakdown of the West that has simultaneously come on with this great economic advancement. Now what? Now what? Are the fascists wrong in that regard? That maybe individual rights makes the individual soulless and even more so harms the greater society? I'm just saying, I like the idea of individual rights. Myself, right? We all believe that we have a certain level of skills or talents and that we should be able to have a certain sense of freedom. But that freedom has come at a cost in these Western liberal republics. And it's not just America, it's all these liberal republics. Now, post-World War II, they're all suffering from the same disease. And that is broken cultures, broken families, and even the financial success of these Western liberal nations is dubious, to say the least, because all of it, especially in America, is being done on national debt. It's not even real prosperity, right? I'm just bringing up the other side. So what do we do when we're in this position? Is it all individual rights? Is it all collectivization, or he's doing it for the state? Or can we find a middle ground? I actually don't have a problem with the nation setting certain social structures to the benefit of the nation as a whole. I don't have a problem with that. The question is, how far do you go? From the reading of this book, it sounded like Mr. Gentili Well, he's making Italy under fascism sound something akin to North Korea, that oppressive society where everybody is worshiping the leader as a deity. Now, from reading my other books, I never got the impression that Mussolini had a deity-like notion about him, or the Italians were worshiping him like a deity, right? I have heard, for example, that, oh, what was it? That there was prayers said to Mussolini. Well, I've looked that up, and it wasn't prayers. They sang songs to the leader, but that's what you do. That's what you did for the king. That's what you do for leaders of a nation. This isn't a democracy. At the end of the day, you do follow your leader to whatever end, whether it's good or whether it's bad. In the case of Mussolini in World War II, you could argue Mussolini ruined the nation. He took many Italians to their end because he couldn't keep them out of that war. And he deserves great critiques for that. But was it an oppressive society? Was it the worship of the state? I think to a certain degree, it's that balance you're trying to find, right? And this is what Mussolini understood, right? What did Mussolini say about communism? He basically said there are a bunch of nut jobs over there. He was a communist himself. There were a bunch of internationalists. He saw their nefarious actions, and he left that movement. He looked at the liberal republics, especially the Anglo nations, America and Britain, and said, listen, that democracy stuff, it's all going to collapse on them, because capitalism always turns into oligarchical rule. That's why he called them plutocracies. And my question is, was he wrong? Was he? I don't think he was. Now, is it prophetic? I mean, you decide for yourself, because a lot of people in those days saw these problems with the Western liberal republics. So you had one corrupt ideology to the left of you. Actually, you had one evil ideology to the east, and you had a corrupt ideology, the governance of the few, the plutocracies of the West that were corrupt to the core. And if you think that the corruption has come in modern times, especially after the 2020 election, that's only because the internet wasn't there yet to expose a lot of it, right? Especially when it came to the World War II era. So, and there's a lot to say about that, but I digress. So, the question is, what's the proper balance? Because I will admit, the way Emilio Gentili lays it out, this sounds like North Korea. It sounds like the worship of the state. It sounds like you're worshiping deities in regards to your political leaders. No individual rights at all. And inherently, you drop everything you have to serve the nation, serve your leader. If he sends you off to die, you die for your nation. Again, from everything I've read, I just don't think that Italian culture was quite that way. There might have been some of that to a certain degree, and I think a lot of it has to do with interpretations. I brought up the issue of the bachelor tax because I do believe that's a very nuanced issue, and it's an interesting debate, right? Do you encourage men to get married? Because we've seen a society with a bunch of unmarried men and what that does. It destroys family, it destroys structure, and it destroys the patriarchal structure of society and the rise of feminism that is now destroying these Western liberal republics. When men aren't married, men are weak. Marriage makes men better. Children make men better. The family is the foundation. See, this is the thing. Conservatives will always say in America that the family is the nucleus of society, the nucleus of the nation. And yet they support everything that would actually destroy the family at the end of the day. And then you wonder why we're falling apart as a nation. I know it's a difficult balance, and I'm giving you one example here, right? What do? Is it fair to tax the bachelor and effectively, what do you want, manipulate men at that time to get married? Is that fair? Probably not. But at the same time, you could understand why they were encouraging this, because they were already seeing the moral problems in America, right? Especially when Italians are going to America to work there because the Protestants are already contraceptive. We're already seeing, again, what do they call it? The gay 20s, right? The gay 20s, right? Where we're in the flappers and they're all partying and dancing and there's sex clubs coming up, right? This is the precursor to the 1960s revolution. And many Italians were already seeing this at the end of the day, right? The other issue, again, individual rights versus what's the collective good. The other thing Mussolini did, and again, this is going to offend liberal sensibility, he banned effectively black soul music, right? Pretty harsh, right? I like black soul music. But his point was that the music, the soul, the jazz music of the black culture coming from America, he felt is a moral digression, that it corrupted the morality of the population, right? Now, again, that offends our liberal sensibilities here in America, where we say, hey, that's freedom, man. You know, right? Twisted Sister. Hey, you gotta fight for your right to party. No, sorry, that's the Beastie Boys, right? But basically, you know, we've had this spirit of rebellion in America. You know, Twisted Sister, we're not gonna take it. No, we're not going to take it, right? This is the American spirit. It goes back to the founding, that revolutionary spirit of the individual. Kiss my ass. I'm an American. You can't tell me what to do, right? The fascists saw that as a corruption of morality. The fascists saw that as something that needed to be ostracized for, again, the common good, right? It goes again to pornography. What do we do with pornography? Is it the common good or is it freedom with pornography? Freedom has prevailed with pornography in America, and now we have several generations of boys and girls, men and women addicted to pornography, and we're seeing the social effects of that in the breakdown of the family. Let's look at American music. Let's be honest here for a second, right? Whether it's Elvis shaking the hips, rock and roll, hardcore rock, and punk, right? Twisted Sister, we're not going to take it anymore, right? All through the sexualization of many different genres of music. How healthy has that music been to our culture? You can say freedom, liberty, freedom, liberty. I get it, right? Who is a government to tell me what we can do? But again, conservatives never deal with the greater cultural debacle of immorality. See, and in many ways, to Catholics in Italy, a devout Catholic nation, that's not an issue. Because the church has always stipulated certain things are right and wrong. This altruistic freedom in America, this license, well, that's more of a Protestant nature, more of a Freemasonic concept. I grew up in the 80s. Madonna, Prince, all that stuff, the punk bands, the grunge music, poisoned at least 3 generations of the youth in this country. Remember when Tipper Gore was trying to ban a lot of the adverse music coming out? Right? And of course, there's a big fight. Freedom, 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 right? We're Americans. You can't tell me what to do. Well, music has been part of the cultural decline. Rock music has. And I say that as a guy that likes rock. Was Mussolini, were the fascists wrong to ban jazz music? Because it had adverse effects on society? I don't know. You make the call. Again, this is about the collective rights versus individual rights. They did that. And guess what? At the time, the church went along with a lot of this, right? When Mussolini banned contraception in Italy, was that a violation of individual rights? Yeah, you could argue that. But we've done the contraception thing here in America, and it's distorted the relationship between the men and the women. Women think they're men and men think they're women. What do you think the trans issue originates from? this 1960s sexual revolution thing. And it's led to the rise of feminism and diminished the role of men in America, right? Again, these things are complex. Now, is there some underlying moral issues that the fascists went too far? Very possible. And there we can have a conversation, right? And so what I'll say in conclusion is this: these things are more complex because Italy was a society governed by the church and its moral tenets, moral principles that have been safeguarded up until that point for over 1900 years. They had tested all these things. Europe had gone through this. It had gone through the French Revolution and the moral chaos that the French Revolution brought throughout all of Europe. They knew exactly what America was about to go through. They knew exactly. They wanted to avoid what happened in France, which became an absolute basket case in terms of morality. A nation that at the time of Mussolini was a government constructed of socialists, Freemasons, and radicals. That's why France and Italy always have problems with each other, ideologically different. One being radically liberal, the other being, guess what, Catholic at the time. That's why they butted heads. And ultimately, it's why they wound up on different sides of World War II. See, Manzini wanted this American French Revolution style democracy and freedom for Italy. But look where we're at in the West. We've been in the century of America, and we've seen the absolute breakdown of morality, culture, society, and now it's corrupted the political system. So what's the right answer here, right? If fascism suppressed all individual rights, and that's what it sounds like for Mr. Gentile, yeah, I may have a problem with that. It sounds very oppressive, dark. You cannot suppress all individual rights. You have to give incentive to man in order to fulfill that element of self-preservation. But Mussolini didn't exactly ban private property either. He didn't tax the crap out of the Italian people, at least not the lower classes. So it would be interesting, and I'll see how far deep I can dive into this, how the social structure of fascism worked, right? Every nation has to have a religious-like devotion. There's no doubt about that, in my opinion. We have it in America. We've always had it in America, right? I was on the political right. America, especially with the founding fathers and the Constitution, is seen as sort of a quasi-religion. And so in Italy, you probably have something similar, only they have greater, bigger, stronger social structures, right? Because they're trying to find that balance between communism and America. So if Italian fascism is a sort of religion, tell me the nation, whether it's communist or classical liberal, that doesn't have a secular religion. The question is, how far do you go, right? And maybe at time the fascist regime did go too far. And I'll look into that for you. But I've given you at least 2 or 3 examples tonight to show that there was some common sense with the fascist regime, at least. And so if I'm wrong, please, oops, sorry. I mean, if I'm wrong, please let me know. If there's any oppressive measures, if, you know, like we've seen in communist nation with collectivization, I'd like to see that. So I'm trying to work this out in my mind. If fascist Italy was something akin to North Korea, I'll be the first to condemn that. I love your guys' input in the comment section. Tell me what you've heard. Guide me in the right direction, right? So I can see the source for myself. I really would like to get Mr. Gentile's book because I really want to get to the bottom of it, right? I look at both sides or all sides very objectively. At the end of the day, as you guys know, I've had critiques of Mussolini. Never should have took Italy to war. Never should have made that alliance with Hitler. I know it was very difficult, but there was a narcissistic aspect of Mussolini ultimately. Nicholas Farrell, in his book, A New Life, called it Fear and greed. That's what dominated Mussolini. Fear and greed, right? On one hand, he feared Hitler. On the other hand, he had his own ambitions of an empire of sorts, in a way too. But there you go, ladies and gentlemen. There you have it. You know, I'm trying to give both sides here, trying to be fair and balanced. I truly want to learn and understand this in a deep and meaningful way, be accurate. And when you have a totalitarian regime that suppresses individual rights, we have to call that out. But sometimes we also have to understand that this open laissez-faire society thing, it hasn't worked in the West. And now we have not just problems, but I mean, we have a deteriorating civilization at this point, and that has to be accounted for. And nobody in the classical liberal camp ever addresses this, right? Well, they'll blame it on politics, right? They'll say something like, well, this is the worst political class we've ever had in the history of the country. Okay, fine, it's a bad political class. But why do we have a bad political class? Maybe because we've raised bad cultures, bad families, bad societies. This is all interrelated at the end of the day, because the fumes of Christendom have vanquished. What is our governing body of moral laws at this point? We don't have it. And as a result, that's leading to corrupt leadership. We don't have a moral compass anymore. And we don't have it in the name of individual rights. That's the irony of it all. Not saying that collectivization is the answer. I'm not at all. It's figuring out the balance between the two. And I know that's dangerous. I get it, right? Once you give government control, how do you wrestle it back? I understand it. But here's the irony of it all. With the liberal republics, the government has still wrestled away the power, and we can't get it back. That's the irony of it all. I want to thank you for joining me tonight, ladies and gentlemen. This is Frank signing off for Frankly Speaking. Good night, everybody.